Is festigary or partying in medias res rather than post festum or after the fact possible? Jamaican mathematician, a friend of mine used to say Americans don't know how to party, they're too formal. The formal has become a difficulty in philosophy so far as the tendency under the power of the fact value distinction has been to drive everything under the name of logic or scientific discussion into a purely formal region where which really means we have rules such as when you have n, you must also have y, or when you have p proposition, you must have z. Simple rules that are to be followed and have uh, nothing to do with anything outside of those rules. So this is a pure formal system is like almost like a game, except that the what keeps it from being a game is that we think there's certain things that are self-evident within a mathematical formal system, such as it seems like the notion that one unit is totally equal to one other unit can actually be um, attested to by a human being, and that it's true even though it cannot be empirically demonstrated, and even though in the proper sense it has no existence outside of the human being. Um, okay, so let's look at in some pure expressionistic extempore discussion, let's muse over Zelensky, over uh, some problems with the current world situation with Robert Bork and with human law as such. So, one explanation for the reason why the Reagan appointee Robert Bork um, got quote unquote borked, which is to say, the term is sometimes glossed as unfairly put down, unfairly. What happened is he went up for confirmation for the Supreme Court, and then he the discussion was such that it displeased the senators in large, and he was voted down. It wasn't that it was a partisan issue so much because Scalia, Justice Scalia, had got in on a unanimous vote within a very close time frame to when Bork came up, and then Justice Kennedy, who was conservative, although later on people declared him a so-called swing judge or gyrating judge, saying that he would go that he was quote unquote weird and therefore not sufficiently conservative according to the conservatives, and not sufficiently liberal according to the liberals. Therefore, I thought that he was more philosophic basically than the other judges, so he didn't please either side. But in any case, the reason for Bork being borked wasn't the current reason, which is that we have the political blocs each vote for their own side, which is not unusual in American politics. There was more cleavage between the political blocs, even when Reagan was running for governor, for instance. He made the remark that he supported everyone on the Republican ticket, as was normal. So it was normal for most of American politics to have a good degree of partisanship, I would say. But in the Supreme Court decisions of that era, it wasn't always done. So it seems like the problem Bork got into is not obvious of how to state, but one way to explain it would be that his views on the laws were a little more complicated than what the political realm usually wants to hear. And so he pissed everyone off by being not against the newly discovered right of the people of privacy, but which had been discovered in the 1964 Griswold case, which had to do with contraception, but that he was against the way in which the principle of privacy was derived through what later became called this living constitution method, and through what Justice O'Donnell dubbed the penumbra and the emanations. And the discussion of this was probably sufficiently complicated to annoy everyone, and so he didn't receive confirmation of his nomination. This points us to a deeper problem in the law, which is that in a certain way, this notion of the penumbra itself is a gray area, or Bork himself understood O'Donnell, or interpreted O'Donnell to be talking about something like there are rights that then become nugatory or useless unless they have certain other rights back behind them, so that if you have the right to pursue happiness but you're denied employment or denied any means of sustenance, that right of to pursue happiness would become nugatory, so that certain protections for employees could then be understood as part of the penumbra on that understanding. But the other understanding of the penumbra, which is more developed in the legal discussion with the Hart-Fuller debate, for instance, with the legal discussion which stems around, it's closer to the Leo Strauss problems, which stems around the difference between natural right and the positive law, which is most quickly glossed by pointing to the Nuremberg defense, so-called, that one cannot merely say that there was a law on the books that said it was legal to ship people to the death camps, and that therefore the citizen was compelled to follow the positive law, the law on the books, because that law was against reason. So that there's another principle that says law is only a law which is by reason, and reason is the life of the law, or in other words, reason is the telos, or the guide of the law, and you can't have a law that's unreasonable. A simpler example of that would be if a state were to make a law that said everyone whose name ends with B would be exempt from taxes, because it's so arbitrary, it would seem to be against reason to do that. And then the Supreme Court could come in and say, well, this law is, even though states are sovereign, they can't do things that are against reason because that's against natural right. So all of these questions are alive in the law and being worked out in specific ways right now, and unfolding in the way they're being understood. In the largest way it's being understood now is through the division of the so-called two legal philosophies, which have been, although they don't originate in Cass Sunstein, the great technocrat, probably the most powerful living technocrat. He wrote a book which really popularized it in the late 80s, I believe, and thematized this notion of the two legal philosophies of originalism, which is Bork and Scalia. Scalia is especially well known for it, but there was supposedly the originalist was one of the justices, which was already on the court, who came out against Douglas's notion of the penumbra. And so this struggle has been going on for some time, but it's only a specific symptom of a discussion which has been going on since the time of Immanuel Kant, with the notion of the das Sollen, or the Art, and the question of the mode of existence of law. So you might think the mode of existence of law is an obscure phrase or abstruse phrase, but this phrase has been used by probably de facto the most effective single legal scholar of the last 100 years, Herbert Wechsler, which is a name which is little known, but through a private organization called the American Law Institute, which has for many years been quote unquote restating the law, and then going out and creating legislation which which clarifies the law under the way they've restated it. This has been probably de facto the most powerful legal organization in the world, since America is the most powerful country in the world. And they have taken very seriously the notion that the mode of existence of the law is a complex thing, and it's not clear. The difference between the is and the ought is a very great question, and one form of the way the question comes in is through this division between the split baby of the Constitution, of the so-called living Constitution and original Constitution, where we must be clear, the originalists are as much, if not more, an innovation as are the living Constitution people. So this notion of privacy, which is considered actually very sacred right by conservatives, came into the American usage under a supposed penumbral emanation, which is to say through the living Constitution theory of the law. And therefore it's a great difficulty for conservatives to argue that consistently. But then you could say, well, we could destroy all the law from 1960 until now and just restate it as an amendment to the Constitution or something like that. So there's a kind of formal argument about the way it ought to be done, and then there's a long question about what the powers of the justices should be. I think about this in connection to Zelensky because Zelensky is supposed to be now posing in the position of a kind of George Washington figure for Ukrainian juridical nationhood. But then the question becomes, who is it that the Ukrainian citizens are? Supposing that Ukrainian citizens have been generated through decades of propaganda and often through dishonest means, so that in fact you could have incidents which are misreported on national news in Ukraine, which would then sway people to new views. They would have the views, but can one say that somebody has a view supporting a juridical position which they only have through manipulation, and then therefore it's almost as you're dealing with a kind of mental illness, a collective mental illness, which ought to be cured rather than treated as an autonomous and true holding of the person that has that view. There becomes a very bizarro situation in our own time due to one, the complexity of the issues involved, but two, the huge amount of money, DARPA programs that go into try to find out how can we change someone's opinion through the most effective scientific techniques without regarding that person as a person to be persuaded, but rather to simply have their opinion changed through direct physical means, as though not by putting a chemical in their body, but through something more like Skinnerism, through conditioned response, through repeating certain phrases, through the most powerful means of changing opinion, but not necessarily really reaching the human being. Where's the line there? So we should go into the details further of this question of what is reason, because reason is supposed to be behind the law, which is behind the physical power of any state through the arm of the police that can be physically enacted. Where does it come from? It's very interesting when you have a private organization which has more power in this regard than any organization on earth, and that you can even say in certain cases there's one or two people that are the most powerful in changing the laws of the world, which are then backed up by a military. And then what is that stood against? And you can ask, can we stand law against morality, where morality is something where there's some freedom for the citizens to persuade one another, whereas law is backed up by the police. A book in this was mentioning that in the 1905 Lochner case, the old standard for breaking into contract, for invalidating contracts which private citizens have made between one another, was very broad. It included not just safety and health, but safety, health, morals, and general welfare. We've dropped the term morals from the terms, and that's just 1905. So the term morals has totally dropped out of the terms that are supposedly acceptable manners, acceptable for courts to use to invalidate the freedom of contract of individuals. But what has happened in that, but it's opened up a vacuum in a certain way because of the vast and acute intensity of the arguments over moral issues, which then appears in the law and doesn't, because there was a general agreement about things like what obscenity was due to general Christian morals, which broke down when sexual views changed in the 60s. What counts as profanity has changed, for instance. That's a moral issue. And then you try to evacuate it from the law, and you get this this kind of disease in there where the shadow of the penumbra, which is like the plate of the law that you can actually see, and then you have kind of a crescent moon of a black shadow, which acts as an abyss, and it's there tacitly, and it's always kind of eating away at the life of the world. And so this needs to be approached and investigated and shown at its deeper level, at the level of the question of the mode of existence of the law. And then we need to show how these questions of the is and the ought have a direct and immediate everyday bearing on political life, whereas because there's like a 200-year gap between how these decisions were discovered by philosophical investigation and how they've come into daily life, it's very hard to see it all at once, how the connection between thinking and what appears as just dumb, stupid political claques yelling at each other is totally part of Dasein's, the life of Dasein, which Dasein can in some way take hold of itself and see what it is doing, sense what it is doing. So the Sorga of Dasein, which is the yay and naysayer, should attempt to interpolate itself into its own fate, into its own Geschichte or history.